Thank you, everyone, for coming down. Really excited to have you here for this discussion, which the purpose of this session is really to look at how the sausage is made. We've gathered some really interesting advocates for policy change from all around the world. And I want to get things going. So first of all, I'd really like to welcome to the stage Dom Hallas, who is director of the Startup Coalition, a lobbying group that gives voice to Britain's tech startups and scale-ups that frankly has transformed the policy landscape in the UK. Described by Sifted as the most influential lobbyist in the UK that you've never heard of, Dom was credited as being instrumental in lobbying the government to save Silicon Valley Bank as it collapsed in 2023, liaising with Treasury officials throughout that crucial period. Dom helps the startup sector punch above its weight in the UK and has won praise for securing all important COVID support during the pandemic too. And in the interest of full disclosure, myself and Dom actually went to university together many, many years ago. We were in the trenches doing our dissertations at kind of 6 a.m.
Britain's a small world.
Yep. So I want to go really right back to the beginning of your advocacy work. Yep. And the way I remember it is that you came back from India where you'd been working for Bloomberg, and you started working with the UK government in the Brexit department. But I think at this stage, you already knew that you wanted to do something to represent the tech community and advocate for policy change. But I think perhaps at this point, you lacked maybe the credibility in the vessel to do that. So I would like to talk to you a little bit about how you settled on Codec, as it was known then, now the Startup Coalition, as the vessel for that change and how that came about.
Yeah, well, thanks for having us. So I think, the UK ecosystem in general has made sort of such tremendous progress over the past 15 years. Like, the stat I was using the other day is in 2014, the UK raised about 4 billion in venture capital. And then in May 2024, in that 1 month, we raised 5 billion in venture capital. And so you've seen this like massive progress. And my kind of career had been in various different forms, whether it was in government as a diplomat or prior to government as a consultant, or even when I was abroad with Bloomberg, seeing this development. And I was like, I got to get into that. That feels like a place that I need to be doing work. And, I work in policy, that's my job, so that was the way in which I was going to kind of engage with it. And I'd seen what was then Codec developing over time, and it had been set up by some great founders in the ecosystem to be an advocacy organization. But if I'm honest, these guys were sort of enthusiastic amateurs, basically, at this game. And in truth, what's necessary as ecosystems develop is a level of professionalization in the way in which you do things. And so I had a really clear sense of what I thought good lobbying would look like, basically, from the perspective of the startup ecosystem. And thankfully was given the chance to do that and have been doing it for the past 8 years.
And you touched on that there, but what was the Startup Coalition pre-Dom Hallas, and how did you transform it into the influential body that it is today? And the angle I'm coming from here is I think we maybe have some delegates in the room who come from countries that lack effective advocacy, and I would like them to learn from you what kind of advice you would have, whether it's starting something new or taking on something that already exists and turning it around.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing to say is that they had a lot of really enthusiastic people who were building great businesses, but who fundamentally didn't understand how politics in the United Kingdom worked. And so, they wanted to speak to government, and government wanted to hear from them, but there was a real kind of gap in the way in which they talk to each other. I always joke that my job is to translate between two different worlds, and sometimes that is very literal. It's like there's a different idiom and way of thinking about things. There's a different time frames to the way in which government works and the way in which startups would work. And so there's a kind of natural barrier that exists between those two groups. And it's not for want of trying on either side, but actually what you find is that the ability to bridge that gap is that difference. And so oftentimes it's as people who are thinking about how do I take this forward and kind of take an organization either that I'm running already or set up a new one or whatever, I think that's the biggest thing to say, is that it's really understanding what are the needs of both groups from each other, the policymakers on the one hand and the entrepreneurs on the other hand, and how do we effectively allow that to be communicated and sit in the middle of that conversation.
And what do you find that founders most frequently misunderstand about the policy-making process? And more broadly, how do you use founders to effectively change policy?
So I think that in terms of what founders misunderstand, I think the biggest thing is that they there is ultimately on both government side and on the founder side an expectation that everyone will understand what they are doing, because they live in their own little world where that's the most important thing possible, right? If you're a founder and you're building your business, that is the most important thing possible. You're spending 60, 70, 80, 90 hours a week building this thing. But the truth is, if you're a civil servant working on a particular part of policy, that's the most important thing in the world. And so I did 2 years in India working for Bloomberg Philanthropies. And what was most striking about that process was ultimately the ability to then understand, like, what is it that this person across the table wants from this, and how do we help them get it, as well as achieving what we want to achieve. And one of the things from founders' point of view is they often go into government and they're like, we need X, we need Y, we need Z, which is, sure, that's fine, but government has goals too, right? As in, ultimately, like, government has goals that sit beyond you. So how do you tell your story and are able to kind of build a case that wraps itself in the way in which government is considering the problem? And so, like, the way we use founders in our advocacy is to use the sort of, I always say they're the qualitative story to our quantitative story. So we'll build evidence base and narrative and structure, and what they will do is go in and say, if you take R&D funding, we'll be like, this is why, all the data shows that R&D funding is valuable. This is the case that we built as a broader coalition. And then you get individual founders to go in and tell the story and be like, here is how R&D has helped me, or here is how this policy has solved my problem, or here is what why this policy is in my way. And I think that it's the ability to kind of blend that wider narrative with the personal stories of the founders that makes it, like in anything, if you're trying to make a convincing case for something, it's those personal stories that make the difference.
And something that I think I've observed you doing, which you can confirm or deny, is to basically use the founder community to make criticisms of the government that you personally can't make. So maybe you can confirm if that's the case, but if so, what other ways do you kind of walk that line between criticizing government but also maintaining influence?
Yeah, so it works differently in different jurisdictions, right? But the British government is a very media-driven environment. Like, they're very kind of beholden to the way in which the press covers the business community, but more generally politics. And so, yeah, you do use that, absolutely. I'm mindful of when you mentioned sort of SVB and the bailout of Silicon Valley Bank at the start, there was a weekend where the UK was negotiating the sale of the bank and ended up going over the line, where I was on the phone to ministers who were begging me to prevent, negative stories coming out, and then I would put the phone down and I'd ring the founders and be like, great, so we've lined up the 3 stories in the paper the next day. As long as it doesn't have our name on it, like, that pressure continued and that pressure mattered. And so I think there is always an element of going to government and saying, look, we're trying to hold back the tide of these angry people who are frustrated at your work. You've kind of got to give us something, otherwise I can't hold back the tide forever. And then at the same time, going to the founders and being like, you have to understand the position government's in, and that's what that translation function is ultimately. But in terms of the relationships, I think one of the biggest things that we do that I think is slightly different to the way in which traditional advocacy works is we're really straightforward and honest with government about where we have problems, where we have issues, and how we're going to behave in those circumstances. So the running joke I always say is when I meet one of the new politicians for the first time, or even civil servants, we always say, we'll stab you in the front, not the back, right? As in, it's like, ultimately, like, we'll be really, really clear, like, if people are unhappy. And again, you're able to do that precisely because founders, they're not FTSE 100 companies in the UK or Fortune 500 companies. They don't have this range of interest. They have opinions because they're building their business, and usually those opinions will manifest. And actually, they're quite happy to be like, actually, not happy, actually. Do you know what I mean? And I think that gives you a different edge. And to politicians, what you find is, especially in a place like the UK, they sit all day in these meetings with people who couch their language or who have come in with a set of notes that they're going to read from because they've got these exact lobbying lines or these specific things that need changing. And it's actually really refreshing for them to go into a room of people who are actually just going to say what they think, as opposed to it being some really sort of structured way in which they're leading them down the garden path to a predefined outcome. And I think that the ability to maintain that authenticity fundamentally is actually really, really important part of what we do.
And so a pivotal moment for the Startup Coalition is the appointment of Rishi Sunak as Chancellor of the Exchequer. And I remember this surreal moment during the pandemic where you managed to get him to be interviewed by yourself on the social media platform Clubhouse.
Whatever happened to that? I don't know.
If anyone remembers that very, very small moment in history. And essentially, Sunak basically says to the entire tech community, if you've got a problem, go speak to Dom about it, and he will sort it with me. And so firstly, that must have felt pretty insane, right? But secondly, there's a way of looking at your success and saying that you did get a bit lucky in that appointment. And if Javid stays in post, you don't get anywhere near that level of access. But what I think people don't see in your work is the sheer amount of work that you do building those relationships with new MPs who are sympathetic to your cause, that you identify as having that potential to rise to the top. So can you tell us a bit how you achieved that relationship and what it was like to have that level of access to the second most powerful politician in the country, who then went on to become prime minister?
Yeah, so just on the sort of latter point, I think, just like I always view my job and the way in which we think about the political process is it's like I'm a venture investor, right? In that, like, we take bets on, like, we can't control politics in the United Kingdom, just like no one can control politics anywhere. The truth is, in reality, there's a bunch of people who are going through this system, and we know the ones that are talented or care about us, and we build relationships with them, but we can't control where they're going to end up. But at the same time, you never stop making those bets, right? So when Rishi Sunak, gets in a great position, we've built a great relationship with him, and he cares deeply. I mean, I've never met someone who cares more about technology as a politician than Rishi Sunak. So a sort of minor anecdote for the room is when Rishi was prime minister, they did a big reception in Washington, D.C. for tech CEOs from the US. And Alex Karp from Palantir was trying to talk to Rishi about a paper from Stanford on AI and the sort of new developments that were happening. And Rishi Sunak turned around to me, he's like, I'm really sorry, that's not what that paper said. What it said was this. And he'd gone through and read that stuff. He was that kind of guy who was super engaged in a way that you can't, but that's not going to be every politician, but you can't control. But the point is, even when you get into that state where you're like, great, we've got a real opportunity to make some progress for someone who cares about this, first of all, you've got to leverage that moment and be like, how do you ram in then as much of our stuff that we care about as possible in a short space of time? How do you sort of swim with the tide of politics? Because when the tide goes out, you're going to be on the defensive and trying to protect what you have in different circumstances with new prime ministers who care about it less or new politicians who care about it less. But the other key thing is, politics doesn't stop when that person gets into office. There's going to be people after him. There's going to be a new wave and so you're constantly building and maintaining those relationships. And, we're doing that right now. We've got, a Labour government that's actually pretty good on technology. Like, we have a really strong relationship with this number 10 and a really strong relationship with the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. But ultimately, there's a new generation that have just got into sort of parliament from the Labour side. About 40 of them really care about technology. We spend a lot of time engaging in detail with those. And there's going to be an election in 4 years' time, and we'll care about who the candidates are going to be. And, it's a constant process of renewal, and we kind of got to renew our work along with it.
And I'm interested to know, because the tide went in your direction there, and you got these incredible wins for the tech community over that period of Sunak being Chancellor. He then becomes prime minister, so in theory you have even more influence, but I'm interested to know what kind of challenges you ran into once that low-hanging fruit had been picked. Yeah,
so I think the biggest thing is and we always say this to founders, but it's sort of self-evident, policy is not a panacea in entrepreneurship, right? Let's be really clear, most policy does not actually matter for founders. As in, government can fuck things up quite badly for you, but actually it's quite hard to make things much easier. So the British government has a thing called the Office for Budget Responsibility, which measures the success impact of public policy on the economic growth of the UK. And at the last budget, the biggest intervention was a change in planning rules to allow more building and zoning. And that had a 0.2% impact on growth in the UK. And you think 0.2% impact, sure, small fry. That is the biggest impact of any public policy intervention since the OBR was founded. And that's how much impact it had, 0.2%. So the idea that policy is solving problems for founders, you want to make it better, but actually the truth is what really matters is the bread and butter stuff and their ability to build great stuff and things outside of policy. And so, you try and get as much done as possible, but you have to be mindful of the fact that you can't change the weather. If the British economy is doing very poorly, it doesn't matter how many great micro interventions we do. One Brexit or one Liz Truss swamps all that away, right? You can't you're in deep trouble. So it's always a tricky balance. I think the one thing I would say in terms of the relationship side of it and how you maintain it is, the other thing about the sort of what I mentioned earlier, which is stabbing people in the front, not the back, is we've always been really clear that where we have people who are supporting our work and driving it, we will be very defensive of them and try and protect them as much as possible. Because in truth, like, politics is a rough business. And, Rishi Sunak spent, in his case, 2 years underwater in polling where everyone hated him. And, this prime minister is already underwater in polling. People don't like politicians, right? And actually trying to be as supportive as possible within that framework and understand, look, like, these people are trying to do their job for us, and actually, like, we will go out and defend them if they're doing a good thing, and we'll criticize them if they're doing a bad thing. But, like, people sort of it's easy to be really supportive of people when they're popular and nice and everyone's doing nice things. It's much more important in many ways and much more valuable to them when they're still trying to fight for you and doing the right things, but actually they're taking on water or eating shit for some other issue that you're like, actually, no, like, these guys, they're all right, actually. And standing up for people in those moments, and like anyone, if you have a hard time as an individual, and your mate's there for you, and they're like, no, actually, we're going to be there and supportive as possible, you value them more than the person who runs away at that moment in time, right?
Very true. And I'm going to finish with a slightly cheeky question. But what is the most that you've ever upset the government, and was it worth it?
So I mean, it's always worth it. I mean, look, like, there's a few occasions that I'm thinking of, but, like, the biggest one was there was a particular piece of work that we were doing on content regulation in the UK and the way in which internet regulation was going to be structured. It was very poorly crafted. Everyone now acknowledges it was very poorly crafted. We made an intervention that was fairly clear about how poorly crafted it was. And I got a letter from a government minister. And actually, it was a measure, I think, of how much we'd known we'd succeeded in growing the organization and its impact, because it was a sort of diatribe of anger, clearly not, it'd been dictated, so it'd been typed out, but it was clearly the minister being like, this is why you've lied about this, this is why you've lied about this, you're such a liar. But it was topped and tailed in the letter by, like, really have great respect for your work and look forward to continuing to work together. And so that's when I knew, like, yeah, the guy was really pissed off, and we had to sort of clean it up in the end. But it's not the end of the world, like, and the world goes round. And in the British government's case over the past decade, usually they're out within 6 months anyway. So. Well,
thank you for that very, very candid interview. Everyone, please, a round of applause for Dom. Yeah. Next up, I'm really delighted to have with us Shweta Rajpal-Kohli, President and CEO of the Startup Policy Forum, an alliance that's rapidly becoming the beating heart of India's startup advocacy, giving a powerful voice to the country's most innovative founders. Widely recognized as one of India's most influential policy leaders in tech, Shweta has shaped the rules of the game for entrepreneurs, bridging the world of venture capital, government, and technology. Please sit down. So, Shweta, let's start at the beginning. What inspired you to launch Startup Policy Forum, and what are the core problems that you're looking to solve?
Thank you so much. I think pretty much similar to what Dom was saying. In our case, particularly in India, I felt there was a clear gap. While founders seem to be building and building rapidly, the one piece that is clearly missing in their building journey is how to communicate with government, how to do that storytelling with government, how do you go and tell government what your problems are. And very often we think that, many countries, including ours, have legacy institutions that have done advocacy for either big tech or for, I would say, India Inc., as we like to call them, which is large business houses in India. But the new age entrepreneur, or as we call them, the new age nation builders, work differently. And, I was very fortunate that at my time with Sequoia Capital India, that's now called Peak 15, I got a chance to work with some of the best and brightest founders in the country. And while working with them, I think the one gap I realized was that there is no industry platform or body who understands their language and can serve as a bridge between policymakers and founders. So that was the idea, and we're very grateful for where we are today. My co-founder Avantika and I, we started last year in November. We hit the road. We launched in December, and today, as we're closing in on our 6-month, milestone, we now have about 60 of India's largest high growth startups as our members that represent about $80 billion in valuation.
That's fantastic. And to give us a bit of a flavor for your work, what are some of the key policy priorities that you're currently focused on?
Tons, Tom. We've got, it's across the spectrum. What I like to say is that we work across both on breadth as well as depth. So the advantage that we have is that we're a neutral platform, we're sector agnostic. So that allows us to work on a number of issues, but few priorities that I'd like to highlight, and one thing that's really, really gathering steam in India is that initially when the startup ecosystem was taking off in India, a lot of the startups were domiciled overseas, many here in the United States, in Delaware, or in Singapore, because the global investors that were pumping in capital into the startup ecosystem felt that it might be more prudent for these startups to actually be domiciled in more, I would say, regulation-friendly, tax-friendly regimes, right? But as these startups grew in size and scale, they realized their market is in India. The regulators are in India, the customers are in India, and we can be very proud of the fact that right now the action is in India. India's capital markets are today the most vibrant around the world. It's where everybody wants to list. So as these companies have reached that size and scale that today they're ready to go public, they feel that there's a need to come back. And this is a trend we call reverse flipping. And so it requires a lot of hurdles to be solved. And we're working with a number of startups who are our members and trying to get them to re-domicile back to India. So that's one problem statement we're solving. But other than that, I think digital payments ecosystem is another one that has really become India's crown jewel. The way India's fintech ecosystem has expanded and is making waves around the world. I mean, our UPI system is now going global, and we're very proud of the way we have been able to scale this ecosystem, the kind of foundation that has been built. So we're helping many of our fintech companies navigate some of the problems that come with the kind of rapid growth that they have seen. Other than that, the usual issues, there isn't a country around the world that's not talking about AI regulations or about data privacy. We still have to get our version of GDPR. So our data privacy, I would say, regulation is in the works and now closing in on coming. So just a dipstick of the kind of issues we work on, but there's never a dull moment.
Of course, and practically speaking, what role does SBF kind of play in bridging that gap between startup founders and policymakers?
Great question. The way we see our organization bridge the gap is across what I say 3 to 4 pillars. The first pillar is pure play policy advocacy. And that speaks to a lot of what Dom was telling us and the way Startup Coalition works, that you're here to do evidence-based advocacy with the government. And that's a gap we fulfill because when founders are building, they don't have the time, they don't necessarily have the skills, or sometimes they don't even have the budgets, unlike big tech that I was fortunate. I worked, so I spent about nearly 2 decades as a journalist, much like Dom. I also started out as a journalist, and around two decades. So, I think the skills that journalism gives you is it allows you to understand the landscape, A, of your country, and 2, the storytelling ability. So after 2 decades in journalism, I worked at Uber and Salesforce. So I led the public policy team for South Asia for Uber as well as for Salesforce. And the one thing that I realized was that big tech gets its policy advocacy very well. There are large teams, there's sophisticated teams, talent is recognized, talent is well paid. But you bring that to the startup ecosystem and you suddenly realize they're completely lost. A, it takes time for them to understand this is critical. You've got to go and tell your story to the government. You've got to go and present the right data to the government and tell them you want policies changed. And it's actually a win-win because, honestly, a government like the Indian government with Prime Minister Modi, he's perhaps one of the only leaders around the world that has put a startup ecosystem on a pedestal. We have a full-fledged flagship program called Startup India. So our startup ecosystem gets tremendous support from the government. But what we want to do is that support should translate into real impact and policies. And that's where we come in. Because our idea is we want to take the pain points, and because we can do it at scale, our founders, as our members, are able to utilize our platform to be able to do that. But back to your question, just to sum up, we have 3 pillars. One is pure play policy advocacy. The second pillar is to support our startups in going global. Because we think that with our network of partners, with institutions like GEN and many other institutions we've partnered, the US-India Business Council, Meridian International, and many others, we think we can we can connect the dots, we can help open doors, we can help them now go global because they've reached that maturity. I think the third pillar for us is pure play community building, because we bring together like-minded founders, and when they're together, magic happens, right? And the fourth and the last pillar we work on is we actually want to promote the Indian startup ecosystem. So global investors, large corporations that want to come into India and would like to tap the startup ecosystem, we are here to provide that support.
That's great. And could you walk us through an example where you've helped drive real policy change? And what did that process look behind the scenes, and what would surprise the audience most about it?
So let me go back to the first example I gave about this reverse flipping trend, which is essentially helping startups domicile back to India because they all went and domiciled overseas. We started this advocacy with our Ministry of Corporate Affairs when I was still at, and I'm going back to an example of, policy advocacy work I did in my previous role, but it's something that we're continuing now with the Startup Policy Forum. So, we went to the Ministry of Corporate Affairs and we said, there is a problem. Our startups want to come back, but we had this, for startups to come back to India and relocate, they had to go through a judicial process which could take about 12 to 18 months. And these delays would mean the valuations have gone through the roof in this time, your tax calculation is out of the window, you cannot have your IPO timelines planned out. And so the delays were pain points, and everybody who does policy knows uncertainty is a pain, right? So they were dealing with those uncertain issues, and when we went to the bureaucrat, I literally knocked the door of a bureaucrat I did not know. So for those who think access is a big deal, sometimes it's all about sharing your narrative in an effective manner. And when I went to this top bureaucrat, the topmost bureaucrat in the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, and laid out that problem statement, he said, well, I want to talk to the people who are getting impacted. So we went back the next week with a bunch of founders who were looking at bringing their startups back. And here I'm talking about big size companies. These are like $6 billion fintech company, another $8 billion company. So these are large companies that are looking at domiciling back in India. This would lead to job creation. This would lead to FDI coming back into India. And to Dom's point, I know I keep referring to what he's saying because I was very excited to see that the rules remain the same wherever in the world you are. It's all about giving that evidence and data. It's all about making it relevant for the stakeholder you're talking to, which is that bureaucrat. What's in it for him? Because if you don't do that messaging, you're not being able to do that effective narrative building. And when we went back with that data, when we put real faces to the names, and we sat across and explained that problem statement, it took us a full year of effective advocacy, but the rule changed. And we brought about that notification and an amendment without a parliamentary process in the Companies Act. But guess what? Today, that same process that took 18 months, it now takes 60 days. So just imagine the business impact of something like that. Something that would take 12 to 18 months can be done in 60 days because the government just didn't know this problem existed. And because we could lobby the government or we could talk to the government, they were ready to problem solve. So that's an example.
And I want to dig a little bit deeper here on the fundamental of why is it important to have founders involved in this process? Not just lobbyists or policy professionals. What do they add that you can't get anywhere else?
I think, number one, when we say founders, a lot of people ask us, we're called the Startup Policy Forum, a lot of people ask us, what's the definition of a startup? Or what's the definition of a founder? Who's a founder? How is it he's different from an entrepreneur? But I think having worked with many founders, and the classic definition is, they're truly out to disrupt what is being done in a regular way. So in that sense, they're playing a very important role in the economy, in being able to do things at rapid scale, because they're building at rapid scale. They are under pressure because most of them would likely be, would have got capital from institutional investors. So there's obviously the pressure from investors. So they have multiple, I would say, pressure points that they're working with. But yet, these are tomorrow's nation builders. They are people who will be your I would say, leaders of tomorrow. So for them to be involved in the policy making process, to have a seat at the policy making table, to be able to articulate what they need, to be able to build at that rapid scale is very, very important, because what we forget is that the government wants to listen. The government wants to be educated. And I think to your point, the most important thing is the government wants to learn, because the government is not out there in the corridors of innovation. They don't know what's going on. So what we do is bridge the corridors of innovation with the corridors of power. And when you bridge that, that's when magic happens.
Absolutely. And you've worked at this intersection of policy, technology, and entrepreneurship for years. I'm interested, as my final question, to know if there was just one insight about achieving policy change that you could have shared with yourself at the beginning of your journey that would have made things a million times easier. What would that be?
Good question. But I would say everything is possible, but nothing is certain. That's policy for you, because you know what? You have to go for the moonshot, and you can't give up. And very often in the policy world, we give up because change is slow. Unlike, I've also been a comms professional, and it's very easy. You can change a headline overnight. You can get things done. So impact is evident out there. But with policy, sometimes you get nothing, and sometimes you get so much impact. So everything is possible, but yes, nothing is certain, because the effort is in your hands, but the outcomes are not. So sometimes we get frustrated when we don't see outcomes, but that's what I'd like to tell my younger self: keep going.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us, Shweta. Big round of applause for Shweta, please. And I'm tremendously excited now. Never mind, don't worry. I'm tremendously excited that we have with us Tom Sullivan, who's Senior Vice President of Small Business Policy at the US Chamber of Commerce, a driving force behind America's small business advocacy for over 30 years. Tom is renowned for transforming the concerns of Main Street entrepreneurs into national policy, channeling the grassroots of local chambers and founders into results in Washington. Described as the voice of small business in the halls of Congress, Tom has been at the forefront of over 100 regulatory and legislative battles, serving as the highest-ranking small business advocate under President George W. Bush and leading the Chamber's Small Business Council today. So, Tom, you have been at the heart of small business advocacy business for over 30 years. Walk me through a time that you achieved a substantial change in policy for the benefit of founders.
Well, thank you, Tom. It's great to be here, and thank you to the other panelists. It's been fun learning. Let's see, greatest highlight. I've given this some thought because you were nice enough to give us questions in advance.
You're not meant to tell them that.
It's all right. We're being authentic, right? Several years ago, a group of creators, artists, musicians, and others, got very frustrated that in order to challenge copyright infringement, they would have to take their case to federal court at a cost to see something through resolution at between $100,000 and $250,000. I don't know about you, Tom, but I don't know many creators who are startups that have $100,000 just kind of sitting around. And we worked with this group of creatives and other associations, and we got a small claims court established so that you could take your case before a judge and take on some of the largest copyright infringers in the world and come out relatively quickly with a resolution that people are happy with. So there are so many parts to that success that I'm proud of, but most of all, the idea that a group who really felt so helpless, where the legal system was supposed to be helping them and they were shut out, to actually solve that for them was really rewarding.
And what about right now? What is an example of what the US Chamber of Commerce is doing to change policy for the benefit of founders?
So right now at the U.S. Chamber, just to let you know who we are and where I work, we represent about 3 million businesses all over the world. Most of those are small businesses that belong to their state or local chamber of commerce. So we partner with about 1,600 state, local chambers of commerce. It was already mentioned before the U.S.-India Business Council, but we actually have 130 American chambers of commerce around the world. representing business interests. So when you ask, well, what are you working on? The simple answer is everything. But from a priority perspective, we have been working for close to 14 months on making sure that the U.S. tax code keeps the pro-growth provisions to prevent a tax hike at the end of this year. There are a number of provisions that are helpful for small businesses, one in particular that has a 20% deduction for most small businesses. It's set to expire at the end of this year. And we have been educating business owners and empowering small business owners to be their own advocates, to plead with Congress and the president, get this done so that we can plan for next year and the year after, and that we're not facing a bigger tax rate at the end of this year.
And obviously, the world looks pretty different now from the era of President George Bush. How do you see that those priorities and challenges have developed in that intervening time period? Have they stayed the same roughly for small business, or do you think we're in a different world?
So this was not a pre-prepared question. So I think that there's a lot similar that has already been discussed, and I think Dom did a really good job of explaining, like, relationship building that's our job as advocacy professionals. Founders and small business owners, their job is to be successful as business owners and employers and community leaders. So us creating that revolving relationship is critically important, and that's stayed the same. Different people, but the same importance of relationships. Quite frankly, a key difference between when I was working for President George W. Bush and now is that the extremes have gotten more extreme. The right wing and the left wing are further apart, and there are fewer, what we would call at the U.S. Chamber, there are fewer elected officials in what we call the governing middle. And that can be really frustrating because you want to reward the governing middle for governing, but you're pissing off twice as many people by doing so, and that can be a challenge.
And what doesn't work when it comes to advocating for policy change?
In my experience, the one thing that doesn't work when we talk about empowering creators to be the best advocates for their own good is when a founder pretends to be a DC insider. So when a founder pretends to be Dom and gets in front of a member of parliament and wants to talk about how the political race is doing or how the latest scandal is playing out, it doesn't work. In the same way as if I were to pretend to be a founder, I'm not. I'm a good advocacy professional, but I'm not a founder. And so you lose that authenticity when a small business owner or founder pretends to be a politician. And I've seen that, unfortunately, I've seen that play out a number of times.
I think that's a great insight. And as you say, you have this role. You've served at a staff level in government and as a Senate confirmed official who's part of the president's team. Plus, you are married to an advocacy professional who was senior staff in House leadership and returned later in life as a committee chief of staff. How do you believe that change is achieved in government?
How is change, excuse me, one more time?
How do you believe change is really achieved in government?
Well, I do kid that, when I started as a government official, I had jet black hair like you, Tom, and now I don't. I think change is achieved through trust. It starts with authenticity. It grows through relationships. But if the advocacy professionals don't have trust, you cannot achieve change. And celebrate the little victories. There are lots of little victories. Again, kind of echoing what Dom said, many times those victories are just preventing government from doing some really stupid stuff. But they deserve to be celebrated. And a lot of my work is trying to give energy back to founders to let them realize that they are making change. They're busy creating and innovating and employing. They don't have the time to step back necessarily and say, oh gosh, I've been lobbying for generalized system of preferences renewal to create free trade zones, and actually I'm making a difference. You know, there's one small business owner who's been up on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. probably 40 times, meeting with members of Congress, explaining the importance of global supply chains. And sometimes I have to give his energy back to him, say, look, you really are making a difference. And you are loosening a knot that's existed for about 8 years now. So there's a lot of work to make sure that folks know that their hard effort as founders, being their own best advocates, actually is making a difference.
That's a great point. And we talk a lot about, in the entrepreneurial community, about celebrating failure. In the policy world, that's generally not a common practice. So would you be able to share any mistakes that you've made in your advocacy career?
Do you have an hour? Well, you know, the creator of Spanx is one of the best spokespeople about celebrating failure. And so I would like to think that parts of my career have echoed her appreciation of failure. Probably the biggest mistake that I've made was when I thought that an environmental policy that would take mom and pop small business restaurant owners out of a liability scheme designed to punish large polluters, I made the mistake of putting all the weight of our advocacy in one Senate relationship and forgetting really a very important lesson that you really have to build a coalition of friends and foes to let them know what you're doing to get legislation across the goal line. And because I had shut off a foe, this particular legislation did not get to the president's desk, and I had a pretty rude awakening when that gentleman came up to me. I was really frustrated, and I said, how did your member of Congress oppose this bill? You wrote it. It was your legislative text. He smiled, not in a nice way, and said, well, you know, maybe you should have checked with me. And that lesson has really stuck with me, is that you can't put all your eggs in one basket when it comes to relationships. You've got to use everything you can at your disposal to help the founders get that legislation across the goal line.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I think a lot that those are the precise relationships that a lot of founders don't want to have to be dealing with themselves. And Tom, I'd be really interested to get your view on this. So the Trump administration has been rolling out its new business agenda, which I think you alluded to, emphasizing tax reform extensions, aggressive deregulation, and a renewed focus on domestic manufacturing. Simultaneously, I think it's fair to say there is some anxiety about the impact of new tariffs, uncertainty around regulations, and general changes in approach at the SBA. Given this climate of uncertainty, what do you think the small business founders should realistically expect from the administration in the coming months? And just as an extra point to that, and from your vantage point, how should business advocates engage with the administration to ensure that the needs of Main Street aren't overshadowed by broader political priorities?
Again, there's a lot, but I'll try to get at each of your questions. So first of all, with regard to the tariffs, so the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has asked the president to have a small business, across-the-board small business exclusion, and there's respectful disagreement on that approach. And what we are doing is we're really doubling down on those areas where we are in agreement with the president. So his deregulatory agenda, for instance, one of his first actions, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent put in place, removed $6.7 billion red tape requirement that small businesses were pretty anxious about. And so we've certainly gone out of our way to compliment the president and the Treasury Secretary for that. We are walking shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand with the president and leadership in the House and the Senate to get pro-growth tax reform done. And so we continue to reiterate that we're on the same page. So anytime we talk about tariffs harming our economy and creating uncertainty in the small business community, we're very quick to follow with, and we are with President Trump on his approach to pro-growth tax reform. In the tariff situation, we believe that the more narratives of how small businesses are struggling, the more we will loosen the knot. Now, how those narratives look are very important, and I'll give you an example. One of our best narratives is a gentleman named Philip Freeman. He founded a company called Murphy's Naturals. It's an all-natural insect spray available on Amazon. And Philip, when he first developed this bug spray, had all of the essential oils sourced from China. That was about 9 years ago. And this is someone who served in our armed forces. He wants that manufacturing to be back in the United States. And over the past 8 years, he's now gotten to 90% of those essential oils used in Murphy's Naturals are produced at his factory in North Carolina. But it took him 8 years. And so explaining that narrative to the president that here's one person that represents millions of other entrepreneurs, he wanted to do what the president wants to do, but he needed time and he needed options. So we get more of those narratives in front of President Trump. We believe that that knot will get loosened, and we believe that if the president can give small businesses more time and create more options like opening up trade in Southeast Asia, then there will be more entrepreneurs like Philip Freeman who will be successful.
Well, that was a fantastic answer and a fantastic conversation. So a round of applause for Tom Sullivan, everyone. And now I'd like to welcome on stage Oswald Osaraton-Gobadia, Managing Partner of Digit-A and a powerhouse advocate for Africa's tech founders. One of the key architects of the Nigeria Startup Act, Oswald has been at the forefront of transforming Nigeria's policy landscape, giving a real voice to startups and scale-ups across the country. He played a leading role in Nigeria's digital transformation agenda and now serves as a key advisor to the UNDP Timbuktu initiative, working to nurture the continent's next generation of entrepreneurs. So, tell me about this process with the Nigerian Startup Act. It was a major piece of digital policy. Can you walk us through how you ensured that founders themselves were at the heart of this process?
Thank you. I'm still stuck on Powerhouse. Okay, so on getting into government, I had this conversation with founders. Being a founder myself, coming from the private sector, I've always made the joke that I was just pretty much undercover within government and taking a class on why things don't work. And I've always said to myself that if I'm ever approached by government to take a role, I would, because I really want to understand what happens in government. I've been in Nigeria running a startup. Well, it's not a startup anymore, but the nature of the environment makes you feel like a startup, for the entirety of the. It's almost a 20-year business, but it still feels like a startup. That I wanted to get a sense of, what happens within government that gives that feeling of lack of progress. Engaging founders once in government, one of the key things that came out is that we needed a bouquet of provisions that would help ease the pain of being a founder or being a business owner on the continent. And that process now led to, it was really private sector led. So it wasn't really a case of, do we need to, normally policy sometimes starts from the government side of things and it leaves out the private sector. With the Nigerian Startup Act, it came from a drive from the private sector saying we need this. And being that we have one of our own there, let's try to accomplish it this period. So it became, what's the process of bringing everybody together to be able to achieve this? So it was a case of ensuring that every part of the private sector was involved, right? So when you think of an ecosystem, and especially an ecosystem that also has fragmentation, there's a lot of fragmentation in the private sector. It's very difficult to get a consensus. One of the key things in policy development, which I now know from my education within government, is really getting to that commonality of whys, right? You never really know why this policy is being done, right? So you can go ahead and make a decision, but why are we here? Why are we having this conversation about this particular policy? What are the reasons and what do we agree on, right? My friends from I4 Policy would say that's the decision making. She's nodding her head back there. But essentially, commonality of why is really important when we bring everybody together under a big tent to understand why are we doing this policy? What is the outcome and what is the goals of essentially doing this policy? And that's what drives the process and getting us to the outcome we desire.
And I think this is why I was so keen to have you on this panel, was that this unique position and perspective you have from being an entrepreneur, then going into government and doing it in a really participatory way. What surprised you most when you got into government about how the policy-making process actually works?
What surprised me most was the fact that there's a lack of, well, this has already been said, right? So there's a lack of trust. But this lack of trust is really birthed from the process of lack of participation. So I did biology in undergrad, so I tend to think everything in biology terms. What tends to happen in the public sector is, in the absence of the private sector, the public sector overgrows its breaches. So if you look at a petri dish and you don't put any reagents in there, one is going to outgrow the other. So what will happen is the public sector will come up with rules, and then after coming up with the rules, they become competition, right? So for instance, in Nigeria, you have governments creating cab services, right? So they've created the rules, they've now created the cab services, which now is not competing with the private sector cab services. So this keeps happening over and over again. So what became very, very clear is this. And this was said earlier. I think Dom said something that was quite similar to this. Is that the private sector continues to run their business, right? And what they're doing is disruptive. They're doing disruption, which is exactly what you want from a startup, right? Go ahead and disrupt this. Disrupt this process, disrupt this new product. Fantastic. And we encourage this and we invest in this. But what happens in the public sector is you don't see disruption. You have no clue what disruption is. Right? What you actually see is that something has changed. Right? You're seeing disruption. Right? You're seeing something has changed in the way you normally do things. And a public sector person only has a few set of tools. Is either you're going to ban it, which is if you do any Google of anything in Africa, you see something got banned. They're either going to change policies that now puts that disruption, on the wrong side of the rules. They're going to do something to try to protect, because that's what a policymaker does. A policymaker protects the economy. The policymaker protects the citizens by creating rule bases. Either as a policy statement that says, this is what you're going to do and this is what you're not going to do in a regulation. A policy statement which is meant to drive behavior says, this is how we're going to do it. They don't see disruption. Right. So in essence, when that happens in one small area in Silicon Valley, DC has no clue, or in Nigeria per se, we have a place called Yaba where it's sort of our Silicon Valley. The policymakers don't know what you're doing from a financial perspective or what you're trying to change to make payments better. All they see is that, somebody has screwed something up, and how do we fix that? And a very classic example of this was, during COVID, Nigeria shot up the ranks on the crypto, use, right? We were like number 2 at some point in time. Everybody's using crypto, but that had a direct impact on the economy because now we had lower amounts of dollars coming in, which has a direct effect on the number of how we change our currency. But if you're a crypto person, you're not going to see the impact of your disruptive activities on creating more crypto platforms. Right? All you're going to see is, whoa, I've created a new way for people to pay for things. I've created a new avenue to pay to China. And, you're making money and it's great. But the CBN sees that and they go ahead and ban it because they see an action that is affecting the economy and they have to protect the economy. So that's sort of an example of the policy issues.
And I think, especially for founders, but probably for everyone, the policy-making process can be incredibly slow and frustrating. How did you convince skeptical entrepreneurs that engaging with government was actually something that was worth their time in the first place?
That's an ongoing problem, and I think even from this conference, you learn that that's a global problem.
Yeah.
Yesterday, I sat on a panel where sort of set up this way with people representing different continents. Later on in the evening, I had a gentleman come up to me and said, "Wow, I learned something from the panel." I said, "Yes, what did you learn?" He said, "The issues of emerging countries are the same as rural Colorado." So the trust deficit remains a big problem. The only way to solve that is a continuous collaboration and transparency, right? We were able to get people to engage government in developing the Nigerian Startup Act. We were able to get people to feel the ownership of the Nigerian Startup Act. But now, there was a change in government. We're unable to have people continue to drive a process to ensure it gets implemented because now the trust has been broken, right? So the breaking of the trust happens from the fact that the new government has not implemented at the same pace at which the original act was created. So it's a back and forth thing. Collaboration is the only way. Essentially, collaboration, coordination. What tends to happen is when there's a lack of collaboration, coordination. So if you have a lack of coordination between different sides of government, you have the feeling that government is not doing what it's supposed to do, right? Government has basically is a mismatch of activities that are happening that are causing different kinds of havoc across the private sector. And then when you have a lack of collaboration and coordination in the private sector, that essentially leads to a loss of value because we're not partnering together to get the desired outcomes. But what really makes it worse is that we have a lack of collaboration and coordination between all the entities in the game. So lack of collaboration within government, lack of collaboration within the private sector, and lack of collaboration and coordination between the private sector and the public sector. So that's what we're trying to solve for.
And I want to pick up on that point you made about collaboration. I think you've described your approach as being big tent. So bringing everyone under the canopy. And I'm interested to know what that looked like in practice. And were there moments where consensus seemed impossible? And how did you navigate those inevitable tensions within the coalition?
So when you say you're going to do something as a startup act, what you will find is everybody who has that same issue is going to say they're working on it. Right? You could actually get distracted from actually taking the initiative of moving forward because everybody is doing, some version of trying to solve the problem. And that really speaks to the lack of collaboration and coordination between the stakeholders. So the idea of big tent and why that became something we started saying is just the fact that we actually went and tried to collapse all the different stakeholder strongholds where such activities around the Startup Act was happening. So that was the very first step, in the sense that, look, we're going to do this and we're going to be successful. If you want to come into a situation when a Startup Act is done, you might as well join this coalition as opposed to doing it yourself. Interestingly enough, just yesterday, this conference has been great.
Thank you.
Yeah. So just yesterday, I ran into somebody from Nigeria who is still complaining because he wasn't part of the big tent, right? And it's not that he wasn't part of the big tent. I think there's a I don't know the nice word to say this, but there's a sort of a self-grandization that makes you think the tent needs to come to you as opposed to you go to the tent, right? There's an activity that is being done that is gathering a coalition and it has a positive direction. It's important that everybody who has any stake in that situation, you're a founder, you're a public sector person, and you believe that a Startup Act will add positive value to the ecosystem, then you join. It sounds a bit dreamy on my part, but that's how we have to get it done. Because there's a lot of problems to solve. We don't really have time for fractions.
And we've talked a lot about your work in government. as you mentioned, there's been a change in government. You left office. I'd like to know a bit more about your current work with UNDP Timbuktu and how that's shaped your understanding of what it takes to firstly build an entrepreneurial ecosystem, but what lessons can we take from this from an advocacy perspective?
Yeah, so this is where it gets a bit exciting. So we understand globally that the problem is a lack of collaboration coordination. We understand that fragmentation is a huge problem in the entire ecosystem. What Timbuktu aims to do is it aims to develop founders through what we call the unipods. So start in the university, where we're training young people, giving them the tools to be able to create their ideas and drive those ideas into actual companies, or just ideas that they could actually work through and present something for it. And then we now have hubs, which are nothing new, but the hubs are thematic based. So we have 10 hubs now, which are based all over the continent. For instance, in Nigeria is a fintech hub. In Rwanda is a health tech hub. In Zambia is a mind tech hub. Now, what makes these hubs interesting is that we basically have people from all over the continent coming into these hubs. So using Nigeria as an example as a fintech hub, we have maybe 45 companies, but representing over 32 countries. So that gives us a good opportunity as a policy advocate myself. It gives us a good opportunity to see what's happening from a fintech perspective, policy perspective, across the entire continent, right? So, and as you're able to plant policy provision changes, or I like to put it, plant big tents across the continent, using a single hub to drive the entire continent. Because from that hub in Lagos, I can drive fintech provision changes across the continent on provisions in different laws that affect just fintech. And we can now go ahead and do the same thing in Zambia for mind tech and in Rwanda for health tech. So the idea is to bring these founders into this hub, focus the incubation and acceleration processes on the exact thematic areas. And then also in addition to that, we have a foundation which is helping with the catalytic funding, the first loss funding, to help fund the investable ideas that come out of the hubs. And of course, the policy unit, which what I run, which is pretty much working on the enabling environment across the continent for these ideas.
That's great, and thank you so much, Oswald. It's been great. Big round of applause for Oswald, please. And last but very much not least, I'm really happy to be joined by Victor Wong, founder and CEO of Right to Start, a national movement championing the rights of entrepreneurs and transforming how America thinks about economic opportunity. Victor has been a driving force behind policy changes that empower founders from every background in every corner of the country. And I think one of the reasons I was really excited to have Victor join is that he's going to be able to give a very different perspective of changing actually at a state and local level, which we've been talking a lot about national advocacy, but as we know in America, a lot of the real change is much more achievable at that more granular level. So let's start with the big picture. You've said that entrepreneurship should be a civic priority, not just an economic one. What do you see as the core barrier that keeps founders' voices out of policymaking, and why does this matter for the country's future?
Well, this is something I think all the other speakers have talked about, which is the challenge of engaging the voices and the needs of entrepreneurs in the civic and policy process, because entrepreneurs are tiny. They have no time, they have no money to be involved in things. And they're also always changing. Like every day there's new founders starting. And it's so if you think of like a lot of other entities, they have established lobbying institutional activities, and it's because they're stable, they're steady state, you can build a lobbying infrastructure around that. Entrepreneurs are constantly dynamic, so there's an inherent flaw in a democratic system that depends on organized special interests when that group is constantly in flux. And so it's an inherent flaw in all kind of entrepreneurial advocacy, which is sort of what we're trying to address. And so the real reframe we're trying to make here, and I've been involved in entrepreneurship work for 25 years, including as an entrepreneur, as an investor, running entrepreneurial support organizations, entrepreneurial consulting, development, et cetera. I've done so many different parts of it, including philanthropy. I was at the Kauffman Foundation where I ran the entrepreneurship department. So I've seen it from so many different sides. What I realized is that we were doing it wrong, that we kept talking about entrepreneurship as yet another special interest to organize around. And when you do that, we're going to lose. because you can never fully organize entrepreneurship at the same scale. There's not enough money there. The group is constantly changing. Entrepreneurs are too busy. It's just too hard. And so we've reframed it as a human right. So when we call it the right to start, we're actually saying that entrepreneurial opportunity is a fundamental right that everyone is born with. And what we found is just by that simple reframe, it's simple in concept, but it's actually very profound, which is it changes the entire dynamic. So when we start going to policymakers, when you go to entrepreneurs and say, not, hey, what are the policies we're interested in to make it easier for you? We say, this is a basic right that every human deserves to aspire to. And we actually did a bipartisan poll. We got 2 of the top pollsters in the United States to help us do a poll to figure out how deeply do Americans hold this. When we ask people, is it important to the future of America that everyone have a fair access to be able to start and grow their own business? 94% of Americans said yes. Our pollsters, who are very well-known pollsters in the U.S., said they see almost no issue like this, where you get 94% approval on this. So it's very deeply ingrained. It's like a deep, soulful, cyclically DNA-driven issue for people. And so when you turn it to a rights-based issue, you ignite people. And so what's happened just by doing that, we've had, out of the 50 states in the U.S., we've had 22 state legislatures that have introduced over 60 bills based on these ideas. We've had thousands of entrepreneurs involved in picking it up because suddenly they feel like this is a right I have. And so that idea of shifting it from policy, changing the game for entrepreneurial advocacy, changing it to a rights-based initiative, and actually using that and still adding the deep policy expertise on top of that. You need sound ideas, you need expert ways to make it better, but to really reframe the narrative is really powerful.
And you mentioned there that you've worked on this legislation all over the country. What, in your view, does it take to move, a good idea from something that actually gets implemented?
Well, I thought I knew government. I studied government at Harvard. I thought I knew everything. You know nothing until you get down into the weeds of a state or city legislative rulemaking process. It's just, in a democratic system like the US, it's just a mess. And you cannot predict on any day what's going to happen. I'll give you one example. I probably shouldn't say this, but our bill passed in Indiana just a few weeks ago, a Right to Start Act bill, which has a number of provisions to help entrepreneurs. And we just found out yesterday that the governor wanted to sign it tomorrow during one of our sessions. And totally random, it just popped up. I know Courtney Zog right there, who's our state coalition manager in Indiana, just informed us yesterday, oh, by the way, the governor wants to do it while we're running another session here. And so we've been actively trying to change that to figure out how do we actually show up at the signing of a bill that was inspired by our ideas. So that's just one example of it, but the winding path and the multi-year journey every bill or idea takes to turn into something is just extraordinary. And sometimes it turns into a bill, sometimes it turns into an executive action, sometimes it trickles out somewhere else and turns into something else, and you just have no idea, and you just constantly nurture and tend it. But I would say generally, the narrative is really critical. The stories, as Tom was saying, the stories of how this affects individuals. It's like, I don't know if it was Dostoevsky who said, one death is a tragedy and a million deaths is a statistic. And that's like entrepreneurship. Like, you start talking statistics and people's eyes glaze over, but you talk about one death, one entrepreneur who's struggled, one heroic journey, and suddenly their eyes light up. Like, well, we can't let that happen. And so I think get at the story, and then you need the expertise about what can be done, because entrepreneurs don't know. They're just not experts in policy. And once you start, what we found is policymakers have said, we love it when the entrepreneurs tell us the story and the problem, and then we come to you for the solution. And we have deep expertise. We have a former state legislator on our team, and so that translation of the narrative to the story to the expertise and what you can do about it is that whole line is really critical.
And congratulations on your success in Indiana.
Thank you.
That's fantastic. But I'm interested also in the times when it doesn't work out, and things. Have you experienced anything that really surprised you, where a piece of legislation you thought was great has been blocked? Are there any kind of stories like that have changed your perspective on how this works?
Oh, sure. I mean, one example, I won't say the state, because I think we're on camera here, so I won't say the state, but we actually had a bill that passed through a legislature, the House and the Senate at the state level, and overwhelming, near unanimous support from both parties on this bill for entrepreneurship. And then we thought, slam dunk. It was same political party was in charge of both chambers and the governorship. We thought this was easy. And it gets to the governor's desk and sits there. We can't find out anything about what's going on. We thought, well, this is strange. And then the governor vetoes it. And just totally unexpected. And we have no explanation for why. And we find out later, it was just not it just wasn't a fit at the moment for the political environment, for the whatever. But you just have no idea. And so what we learned, though, is you cannot trust that these things just naturally happen. And so what we've learned is do not accept that just because of the same political party in charge of the legislature and the governorship that it's going to flow through. And so we learned the next state that happened in, we passed through both chambers, and we knew it was about to go to the governor's desk. And we actually decided to work with leaders in the community to write op-eds and place the op-eds reframing this as important to the governor's priorities a few weeks right before it got to the governor's desk. And so by the time it gets to the governor's desk, it's now the governor's bill. And so you've got to but that's, there's no formula. You can't do that every time either. You just have to constantly be reading the situation and trying to understand what do we need here at this moment for this what's the specific key to unlock this particular lock. And it just requires a lot of constant tending and thought.
That's great. And you mentioned earlier, just how busy founders are for the most part. How do you approach persuading them to give up their time? And also, kind of simultaneously, what advice would you give to a founder who wants to get involved but doesn't really know how best to utilize their limited time?
Well, we're still figuring it out. It's constant learning, but I'd say that easier you can make it, the lower the barrier for people who are extremely busy, who have no time to spare, the better. And they care a little bit, just like they care about, issues in their community. But do they have time to show up and organize a meeting with a city council member or a legislator or a congressperson? Almost never, because they're just busy. But can you make it super easy where it's, as simple as share this, like that, or record your story on a video, or sign this form here, put your signature on this petition, or show up to a meeting. We have everything arranged for you and tell your story. So reducing barriers to get the stories told is critical. And so we're getting ready to launch a campaign for next year. Next year is America's 250th birthday. And we're about to launch a national campaign to celebrate that moment and make entrepreneurship a core part of America's 250th. So we call this campaign America the Entrepreneurial. We're doing an official groundbreaking later today at 5:30 here. And as a big part of it, the very first push we're going to do is around storytelling and creating a platform and easy ways for entrepreneurs to tell their stories about their entrepreneurial journeys and just make it fun and easy so it becomes something that everyone can participate in.
And I think as we kind of discussed with Oswald, the policy process is seen as very slow, but also actually, it would be inappropriate for it probably to move as fast as founders want. But how do you manage that kind of tension when you're kind of working with your coalition and advocating for change? They work at different clock speeds, to borrow a computer science term. With the entrepreneurs, they're willing to be patient, I think, if they just know that the effort taken of them is not going to be too much. If it's going to be a 3-year process to drive, a legislative change, let's say, for instance, then they're not going to be investing tons of hours every month to do that. But if you know that they just need a little bit, they need to show up to testify here, we need their story here, one email there, that can help. And so you make it as simple as possible, even if it takes multiple years to pull it off. Yeah. And I really want to finish on a positive note today. So what gives you hope? So in a moment of polarization and economic uncertainty, what keeps you optimistic about the movement to empower entrepreneurs through policy? Well, there's a lot of polarization in this country. There's a sense from both parties that things just aren't working, in the right way in the country. Like why, people don't, we're not talking and we're not building things the way we used to.
And this is what our polling shows as well. And entrepreneurship, this issue of entrepreneurial opportunity is a 94% polling issue. And this is about the only major economic issue that we agree on today, is that everyone deserves the right to be able to pursue their entrepreneurial aspirations, and they deserve some kind of fair shot at doing so. And so I believe that gives me hope. And in fact, to borrow a Star Wars phrase, rebellions are built on hope. If any of you watching Andor, you would know this. But this is the unifying thing. And it actually is what we found as we've gone out there, that this is actually, in many ways, when we say this is, we're going to do this, America the Entrepreneurial, we're going to launch a national campaign for America 250. One of the really immediate responses from entrepreneurs, but also from non-entrepreneurs is, well, that's what built America. That's who we are. And so the hope is we can go back to first principles about why entrepreneurship really matters, which is about giving people the means to build and create their own futures and control their own economic destinies. And when you put it in those terms, people light up. And if we can reconstruct this framework around entrepreneurship as a means of hope for renewing America, renewing society, renewing our communities that are left behind, it can really work. I'll add one thing, which is sort of a final coda to all this, which is one of the reasons this is important, is reframing it as a right, we found, is because, and this is after doing this work for so long, is that entrepreneurship is not a one-issue problem. It's not like it can be solved with this fund, this loan guarantee, or this tax break, or this program, which is what tends to get done. It's actually a 360-degree problem. It's taxes, it's red tape, but it's also economic development, it's the way education is done, healthcare, childcare, government contracting, workforce development. Pretty much any issue in American life affects entrepreneurs. And so by framing it as a silver bullet problem, we lose the heart and the soul of the issue. And so by reframing it though as a right, you suddenly unlock the potential to talk and have input on every issue that matters to entrepreneurs. And so we have to rethink how we do that. That's been our lesson, is rethinking the problem, not as something that can be solved with a program or one passage of one law, but as a 360-degree problem that cuts across many, many aspects of our society.
Well, thank you so much, Victor. A big round of applause. And I'm going to hand over to Dom now, who's going to moderate the next section of the session, which will be a panel of all our brilliant speakers.
Thanks so much. Can I just invite the speakers back up? I thought that was fantastic. And by the way, Victor, after that sort of call to arms on behalf of the American entrepreneurial ecosystem, I'm ready to throw my own tea in the harbour. So that was fantastic. Oz, do you want to come up as well?
But we like our Earl Grey.
Yeah, well, that's fine then. Well, I'll forgive you for that. Have we got mics for everyone, Tom? Like, I don't know where. We got the one's fallen behind us now. I'll run around and grab it. Hang on. There you go. Do you want to grab that one, Shretter? There you go. You take that one. We got a couple more. Yeah, we'll go good. Everyone got one? What's that? Awesome. All right. So we've probably got about 20 odd minutes left. I wanted to ask, I was interested in kind of one question that I'm going to ask everyone in different ways, and then we'll spin it over to questions from the audience, and I'll have one more addition. But what struck me is, like, there's so many similarities through those conversations, which is really fascinating. But one of the things that's really strikingly different is the context in which everyone here is operating, right? Like, everyone has their own quirks and jurisdictions and things like that. And so I'm going to ask a sort of question about those differences. I wanted to start with you, Shweta, which is, like, fundamentally in that kind of operating environment, I think, therefore, if you're folks like Victor or folks like Tom, you're almost having to work out how to stand out more. Whereas sometimes and I worked in India for a couple of years, a lot of it is almost explaining how advocacy works to founders, right? And how do you find that process, like that journey of, this is actually what we're doing, and a sort of, like, not necessarily in the Indian context, but I remember talking to founders in a different part of the world and did this really great talk in front of this fantastic tech crowd. And the first question that I got after the hands went up is, and what happens when the politician asks to be paid? And you're like, no. Like, that's not. But almost the explaining, this is what advocacy means practically. How do you take people on that journey? What does that look like?
I love that question because it's what we do for a living, right? But it's not easy, and yet it's fun, because it's true that when startups, and I'll give you an anecdote. So there was, one startup founder, female founder, who was building a fintech company in India, which is now listed. But when she started out a while ago, but when she and I started engaging about 5 years ago, and I started educating her and saying, you need to show up at times in front of policymakers. You've got to tell your story. You've got to be at these conferences when needed, or engagements that we organize, or just do one-on-one direct meetings, or write op-eds. I heard someone talk op-eds. Or write op-eds, And it all seemed alien to her initially. And she had a very, I would say, innocent response. She said, Shweta, I'm a founder. I'm a CTO. I know how to build. I know my math, but I don't know my English, So I cannot, this is not something that comes intuitively to me. It is not something that comes naturally to me. So it's hard. And two, is it really worth my time? What is my ROI? Because
That's
I'd rather be,
right?
Exactly, I'd rather be building, and I'd rather be with my team, or I'll be with my customers, and I'm going to be with my, employees. Those are my stakeholders. And you know what? Before we can do the policy stakeholder mapping, you have to literally whiteboard and say, government is a stakeholder. And government is a stakeholder regardless of whether you're a regulated entity or not, regardless of whether you want regulations or not. You have to know that you will reach a size and scale where you will have an interface with government, good, bad, ugly. And it's the relationships you're going to build in peacetime or in that early journey that will come of use later. And I think that conversation is hard because, number one, I don't blame the founders. They're just so involved in, my customer, it's very hard to see that there is a world outside that. But I always say one thing. I said, treat them as much of a customer as your customer is.
Right. Yeah, no, there's definitely, government, you might not be interested in government, but government's interested in you, I can tell you that.
Correct. And I'll just close it in 10 seconds to say today that same founder is a very big believer. She's doing fantastic. She's in and out of government offices, meeting ministers, and is now a listed company and loves this part of it. But it was a journey. It was a journey.
No, that's really good. And I was going to come to Tom and then Victor on this. The interesting thing for you guys in the States is, the US is not only the world's largest economy, it's also the world's largest advocacy market. And how do you stand out in what you guys are doing? Obviously at the Chamber of Commerce, you guys have an amazing brand and but how do you make what you're doing distinctive amid all the noise of the advocacy environment?
Well, thank you. I'm going to borrow something that Oswald taught that really resonated with me. Oswald, you described your work with founders as creating a bouquet of options. I love that expression. We have two different bouquets. There's a bouquet that we try to offer our advocates. I work with about 100 small business owners, and that bouquet consists of, one flower are op-eds. One flower is something as simple as a quote that's used to back up data or statistics. A little bit of a bigger flower is testifying in front of Congress. The biggest and most important flower in the bouquet is hosting an elected official at your place of business from a relationship perspective. And then we have our own bouquet of communications, political, regional, and it is really a wonderful thing when all of that comes together in a beautiful looking bouquet. I will give all of you a little bit of a secret that's worked for us after many failures. What we found to be really effective amongst a group of 50 to 100 founders or entrepreneurs is a competitive environment. And it, in a very positive way, but we've started tracking engagement, and these founders know how each other are doing. Victor placed 2 op-eds last week, and Shweta testified. So I've got to work harder to give more flowers into that bouquet. It's a lot of fun. We track it. Every 6 months we share with these founders how each other are doing. It's very good spirited, but make no mistake, they are really, really competitive. And That's actually kind of up to the game as far as setting ourselves apart in the authenticity of stories and using those stories for advocacy purposes.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I was going to come to you on Victor as well, Victor. Like when you're, advocating at state and local level, like there are people in and out of those offices every day. Like, how do you make what you're doing stand out?
It's those stories that really tug at the heartstrings. I think when you can get an entrepreneur who says, "Oh yeah, that's something that really nearly killed me. I put my whole life on the line. We second mortgaged our house. All these things that nearly broke me. There's nothing replacing that." One thing I learned this trick at the Kauffman Foundation, because we did lots of interviews of entrepreneurs, which is on almost any entrepreneurial story, if you scratch just a little bit under the surface, you can get an entrepreneur to cry. Like there's so much heart in every business.
I mean, you don't work in Britain, mate, is all I would say. I can guarantee you work in an entrepreneur.
Right.
We're too hard. It's like we're too awkward. But that is the emotional side for sure makes a huge difference, right?
It really does, and it moves policy. I mean, honestly, because it shows that this is not some abstraction anymore. This is a tragic story. Every entrepreneurial story, from not just a great tech startup, but every restaurant you see, someone had a heroic journey to build that thing and keep it afloat. These are the unsung heroic stories all around us every day of our lives. And so getting that told. One other aspect of this work I'll add, which is the unification of those two aspects, from the high-tech, high-growth tech startup to the little business on the corner, to the person building a home business in their basement or their bedroom. We need to unify that story, because a big challenge of our work has been that we've kind of been split off. You got the tech startup community that has its own issues. Clearly, they have their own issues. The people running retail businesses have their own issues. But it's all one part of the entrepreneurial journey of everybody. Everybody's got a common set of way of thinking of their dreams and their aspirations. And so that's been a big part of our work, which is try to say this is actually one common human story.
Yeah, no, that's really great. And also, I was going to come to you on, actually, from a kind of internally building what you were building in government, sort of in that dual role. Like, how did you convince people? Because there's so many of these initiatives, and people are trying to do this all the time, and it turns out it's really hard, and a lot of times it doesn't work. How did you convince people that this time was worth it in an environment where people probably would have been like, "Oh no, people have tried this before." Like that kind of building the coalition that way. What was the thing that made the difference there?
So I think that we understate the credibility of the person who's having the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So not to toot my own horn, my own personal credibility took some play into who believed the vision that was being sold. So strategically picking the right person to have the right conversation.
Right.
Also using the right people within the different aspects of the skill sets that are required to get the job done. My dear co-panelist just said just now, I'm a founder, CTO, I love math, I can't write, right? But when you join this collaborative group, there's somebody in there that can write. And I think some of the things I didn't say earlier, to do the Nigerian Startup Act, we ran all sort of things. I'm talking, you're sitting on my document, I go to your hometown, I do a rally, I take pictures, and I send to you. Your local government wants this done. So we did everything, animation, we wrote articles. If somebody was there and they could do animation, you did animation. Because it was about selling the message. It was about getting government to believe this thing is important. Elections is coming up. Okay, guess what? I'm going to put young people in front of the National Assembly and have them wear T-shirts that say, we only vote for those who care about us, right? So as private sector, but we have to use everything within our disposal. And I think what tends to happen is more so the disengagement is the problem, right? So private sector believes, oh no, we don't really need to participate. Government is going to do their thing. I'm going to grow my business. But what I've now learned is that a lot of these, especially in emerging economies, and I'll say this, and I'm sure it's the same thing here, but I just don't know enough to say it's the same thing in the US or more developed economies. But I think in some instances, in developing economies, it was supposed to be 70 million was the exit, not 7, right? But because you only put 10 in, right, and you took 7, it's an amazing outcome. But it really was supposed to be 70. based on the business plan and the need in the market and and the idea you have. It was supposed to be $70 million.
How do you keep it ambitious enough? Yeah.
Exactly. That was really what you were supposed to get. But the environment, the soil, is just not right. Right? So the idea is the seed, and you can plant that seed in any soil you want. The financing is the water, is going to water the seed, but the soil is actually the policy. The environment in which you plant those ideas in is really critical. So I always tell young people in the environment, know the policies and regulations that governs the business that you're in. Otherwise, you're going to lose out.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think it's a really interesting lesson in the policy landscape as well of people keeping high expectations of government, right? Ultimately, it's the right of people to, founders and entrepreneurs to demand that government is supportive of them and demand that they have, they're achieving things in the way that the entrepreneurs are achieving things. It's not simply sort of going there and being like, oh, well, they're going to be crap anyway, right? Like, that's not the point. We're going to take some questions now if folks have them in the crowd. Tom's got a roaming mic, the gentleman second row there. Just say who you are and where you're from, and then...
Tim Betcher from the United States. Thank you. This is really valuable sharing. In talking about advocacy strategies in general, there are grassroots strategies and grass-top strategies. The grassroots has the benefit of building constituency and strength in numbers, building pressure. At the grass tops, you're making use of access and expertise, like both have their advantages. Now, in the startup world, startups tend to be smaller and not necessarily organized or understood in the way that legacy businesses are. So how much scope is there for grassroots strategies, and how realistic are they?
Yeah, it's a really interesting. I don't know whether anyone wants to come in on that. You're ready to go, Victor?
Yeah, we do both, and we found it to be essential to do both. Grassroots, we talk about lifting the voices from the grassroots up to the grass tops, and one of the issues we found is if you just do a grass tops, if you just work with leaders, there's no constituency behind something. Like, it's just an abstraction, and you might win a little bit, but it's hard to sustain over time in a democratic system because they want to know who cares, who votes on this issue, and that's what happened in that one state where our bill was vetoed. Is the governor didn't see the constituency. There was no voice, and an op-ed shows the voice. A group of people writing emails or letters to the governor shows the voice. People showing up to a meeting shows the voice. But you need to have that grassroots voice. Otherwise, they look at it and say, if I veto this, no one cares. And so you've got to connect the dots between the grassroots and the grass tops.
Yeah, Oz, do you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, I just have to say that, I love these kind of panels because as a policymaker on a different continent, you learn that the problems are the same, right? And the approach is essentially the same. He said both, and I threw my hand up in the air because that's exactly what I was thinking. So for instance, for Timbuktu, what I thought I designed, I really didn't because it's the only way to do it, is sort of a strategy that is what I call harmonization and mobilization. So if you're thinking about a Pan-African or a whole continental approach, right, you're going to be dealing on country to country or on a local government level, different policies that affect business. That's really grassroots, right? So you need to get together a lot of startups, a lot of founders to try to drive and try to create change on every level of government within the country, right? Because, there really are no companies, and this may not apply to America, but in Nigeria, for instance, there are no companies that exist within the federal government. They're all on the state level, right? And the same thing, the states, the gentleman here he's mentioned state. So the rule bases in the states affect companies way more than we think they do. So it's important to be able to address the issues on that level where you're making changes. And that data from those levels can now affect continental-wide policies. So when you're looking at Africa, we're still thinking about things like, free trade zones, right? So we're in the process of building the largest free trade zone in the world, the AFCFTA. So now that will lead to harmonization of policies. Why harmonization of policies? Because you still need visas. Nigerian, you need to go from Nigeria to another country on the continent. You guys probably have a better opportunity to go to all the countries before I would, because immigration is just a problem. Then you now start going to all the other aspects of trade. So if you can't move human beings, there's visa problems. If you can't move human beings, then you can't move commerce. Commerce follows people. So it's a case of you have to do both at the same time. Sort of a sandwich.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think the other thing I was just going to add to that is I've always seen policy as a sales job, ultimately, right? You've got to have a great product, which is the policy that you're developing, but you've got to also have a reason to buy it which is usually the founders and the grassroots push, but crucially a reason to buy it now, right? Which is the burning platform that you're creating. And so that's natural that it almost sits throughout the stack that we're talking about there. Any more questions from the crowd? I have one more for the panel. There's the lady in the corner over there.
Hi, I'm Andy. I live here in Indiana, and I love this because I'm deeply involved in Department of Commerce, State Department, advocacy work, entrepreneurship, all the things. So thank you all for the work that you do. I think my question is, Victor, I totally agree with your points about why is advocacy not happening in entrepreneurship, and it's because it's a constantly changing landscape, and they don't have time, they don't have money. But I think another big gap is that they don't know how. They don't know what advocacy is. And you say, "Ooh, can you help with this bill or this piece of legislation?" And they're like, "Holy shit, no, I don't even know. I don't know those people. I don't know what does that even mean?" So truly, like we've said, it's op-eds. It's just sitting down and having a meeting. They don't have time, but they have meetings all the time. They can have a meeting. And so are there good... and maybe it is Right to Start, and I'm still getting to know Right to Start. Courtney is a friend. So are there good agencies or programs where we can point entrepreneurs and say, like, here's a tutorial. Here's somebody that can educate you on how to do this work? Thank you.
It's an interesting question. Go on, Victor. You jump in. I was going to say, but yeah, how do you teach people to do this?
Yeah, how do you educate? We've tried teaching people a lot of ways. So we have an online advocacy course people can take, and it's like a few videos they watch, and that's great. And that's good. We do find people get intimidated. They're very intimidated. Even really smart, successful people are very intimidated by this because it's hard. It takes guts to do something you're not familiar with, and it feels like the system is, big and scary. And we also found that it's really hard to teach someone who's really smart about their domain and their business, like a whole new domain of policy. Like a simple thing like, like how do you reduce red tape in licensing or permitting? You'd think that's really simple. It's such a complicated discussion. And so we found it doesn't really work that well. It's better if they tell, actually what Tom was saying, it's better if they tell their story about how hard it was. And then they turn to the organization with its expertise on, and here's our solutions on how to address that. Because they're really not good at explaining the policy intricacies, and once they're challenged with something, they kind of collapse. They don't. I don't know, and it's hard to become an expert really fast. And not to that's something like the cost of licensing or the burden of that. Not to mention like the more complicated issues around tax policy or economic development reform. I mean, it's just their brains blow up. So it's too much to ask them to do that.
No, and I think I'm going to come to Shweta on this in a minute because I know you'd mentioned your sort of journey with that founder. I think one of the interesting things we found is actually we used to take founders into Parliament in the UK, and they turn up in their suit and tie, all looking awkward because that's not how they dress any day of the week, right? And they'd bumble in, and then they wouldn't know how to speak to politicians. And one of the biggest things we did is, I turn up now everywhere dressed like this. No, if I go to Downing Street, I still dress like this. I let the founders dress how they want. They feel more comfortable. B, we get the politicians to come to Shoreditch in East London or any of these co-working spaces. And actually, helpfully, you then get an environment where the politicians themselves are like, oh shit, I should take my tie off. Like, I feel like, I've got to fit in here. And it sort of completely flips that dynamic of you're in a place asking for something and demanding something of these people at the other side of this big important table in a wood paneled room looking serious to, no, you're in your environment and they're here to ask how they can help you. And so sometimes it's almost literally the physical environment that you're building. Like, Shweta, like you talked a bit about sort of taking that founder on that journey. Like, what was the moment where it clicked for her? Like, because you said she's gone on that journey. Now she's like, this is great. I enjoy it. Was there like a single thing, or was it just a constant hammering away?
So the answer is simple. It's just doing it. You learn on the job. The more you do it, the more you engage with government, the more you realize that, there is a trust deficit that exists. And that's partly because there is a fear of the unknown. You've never walked through those corridors of power. You have never entered a government building. So to your point, some of them would say, oh, will I have to pay some? No, we don't do this stuff, right? I mean, at some point you'd be governed by FCPA and there's no way you're going to be, and there are no payoffs involved. It's a simple trust building process, and unless you've gone through it, you don't know the power of it. And once you've done it, you actually become a pro at it. I'll just quickly add one more point because I loved your anecdote around dressing up. To me, the best moments are when founders have called me from a clothing store to say, hey, can I just take you on a video call? Is this okay? When I'm going to a government meeting, can I wear this? And it's just so fascinating to see how there is so much excitement about engaging with government officials and how you sometimes have to coach them and say, yeah, okay, I mean, jeans is okay, but make sure you get a blazer on. So, stuff like that.
There is a line somewhere. Yeah.
There is a line somewhere, but I think the fun part is making them go through that journey. Because once they've done it a few times, they realize that it's not so hard, A, and 2, there is value in it.
Yeah, and politicians are human beings, right? Sorry, Tom, go on.
Yeah, that's right. We've learned the lesson the hard way, and we have a boot camp before we go and meet with the elected officials. And what we found is it gets them over the fear. We find out who the leaders are, and the next time those leaders become the trainers of everybody else. The peer-to-peer training that happens in advocacy is really no different than the peer-to-peer learning that we're experiencing here at this conference. In advocacy, it helps those peers get over that fear factor.
100%. No, look, that was a really interesting conversation. Thanks so much to the panelists. Thanks so much to the crowd. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure everyone here will happily chat with whoever afterwards and can sort of continue the conversation. So thanks very much. Really appreciate it.